Brilliant. Well, welcome everybody to our next instalment of our In Conversation series for the Avada Associates Featured Artist. So last time we were joined by Claire, who handed the mantle over to Rhiannon Evans. So we're really pleased to welcome them both today for their In Conversation and to hear more about Rhiannon's practice after we've seen her brilliant posts on the Instagram residency and the blog on the website that you may have already seen. So I will hand over straight to them in just a moment, and then at the end of their conversation we'll have some time for any extra questions that you might have. So feel free to either pop them in the chat as we go and we can come back to them, or if you'd rather use your microphone later on, then that's fine too. So I will hand over to Claire and Rhiannon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, hi, Rhiannon.
Hello, Claire.
It's a real pleasure to be having this conversation with you today. We've known each other for a lot of years and I love talking with you. We always have such animated and interesting, if not at times opaque for me, conversations. So I'm really hoping today the questions I ask will be helpful and illuminating, and I'm just really looking forward to our chat. So shall I start with the first question?
Certainly, yeah.
Okay, well, you came to art practice later in life, having worked in botanical science. Can you tell us what the links are between science and art in your work?
Well, when I originally started going to art school at the local college, I particularly avoided anything to do with botany or science because I wanted it to be completely separate. It was just a source of enjoyment. And then I realised, I think it was probably towards the end of my foundation, that actually when I did sciences at school, of course, we didn't have access to photography for recording any images. So if you did any microscope drawing, you actually physically did the drawing. If you did dissection of any animals, then you physically recorded it through drawing. And when you were drawing, doing laboratory experiments, as part of the setup, you drew the apparatus that you would be using. So there was actually an awful lot of drawing, even at school level. And so on still through university. I mean, I can remember drawing a human brain and bones in, I can't think what they call it now, but yeah, but in one of the anatomy courses. So there was an awful lot of drawing that I hadn't really recognised as being drawing because it was done in a science context. But I still wanted to keep them separate. And when I went to CSM to do the BA, I knew then, I recognised that I'd come from that background, but I still wanted to keep it separate. I think because I felt that I just wanted to see a different way of working. And that's certainly been the case, actually, because I know that when I was working in science, I can't say it's a different part of my brain, but the way that I approach things was completely different from the way that I approach art practice. Because of course everything, everything had to be categorized and uniform and so on, because that's what you want in an experimental field. You want to make things as uniform as possible, whereas it's almost exactly the opposite when you're working creatively. But then I realised that, of course, at art school, everything's very academized, I can never say that word, and evaluated now, and scored and sort of marked. And particularly as you move along in your BA towards the end, where the evaluation is almost obsessive now in art, and it's almost as if you can, if you produce the right written work to go with the work that you've done, that you can sometimes I feel that you can almost tick the boxes and get a good qualification when your work could be okay, and somebody maybe who is actually producing magnificent work but can't necessarily fulfill the academic criteria doesn't necessarily get such a good qualification. And I thought that was sort of interesting, and I just kept thinking more and more about sort of the evaluation and quantification of that. And then, because I was working very much on sort of ideas of witnessing and memory and personal experience, sort of thinking about how there's a desire to quantify experience all the time, particularly in terms of sort of digital binary data. You have to reduce things effectively down to ones and zeros to get it into a format that people can understand, and that really it doesn't fit with most of our embodied experiences of life, which aren't directly quantifiable. I feel.
It's certainly true. I think looking at your work, and particularly perhaps some of the object-based and drawing-based work in recent exhibitions, that impulse, that desire to be archiving, to be analysing, to be categorising, to be really probing and investigating is clearly an ongoing attitude to making. It seems to be inherent to who you are as a maker. But I observed too that in another strand in your work, which was perhaps the first encounter I had with your work some years ago, which one might see almost in contrast to that, although it is clearly informed by it, is your participative, socially engaged kind of performance work. And I've seen you work with audiences in different situations, and those works resonate with the sort of spontaneity. You welcome chance and happenstance. They're site-specific, they're humorous, they're playful, characteristics you wouldn't normally associate with a science-based attitude to work. Somebody needs to go on mute, I think, yeah. So can you talk a little bit about that and how you took that attitude into your performance work, and what the role of the audience is, how important they are to the work?
Yeah, well, I think that part of the desire to and drive thinking about the quantifying of this experience came through doing some of the performative work. Because if you're doing performance work, then and you're working with a group of people, then each of the people in the audience has a very different experience of what's actually happening. And of course, if you try to document that, which you need to for the evaluation, because otherwise nobody knows what you've done. There's a lot of debate about that, but particularly if you're doing an academic course, you have to have something to show people. That's where that rub comes up, really. That how do you do that? How do you make something that gives some sort of experience of not just me, but some of the other people in the group, as they have been recipients of or participants in any performance work. And you're right, I do like the sort of chance and happenstance element of it, and I really enjoy the audience being part of the work in a way that I can't control. So there's this, it's almost like there's these two parts. There's the sort of more scientific, analytical, trying to pin it down thing. Yes. And then there's the other side, which is, well, let's just go with it and see what happens. I mean,
I've observed in the more recent work you've done that there almost seems to have been a blending or a melding together of those attitudes, in that actually within exhibitions, so they're not stated to be performance, and yet when I've observed you interacting with the audience who've come to see the exhibition, they haven't come to see a performance, but in the way that you have engaged with them, which has largely been very kind of conversational and approachable, but has been clearly with the intention of really engaging the audience perhaps more than one would generally expect to do in an exhibition. You really want to communicate to them the content, to share the material, the sources, your attitude to it, even your uncertainties about it. So it's almost as though you're trying to demystify it for the audience through conversation, and possibly at the same time demystify it for yourself too. I don't know if that's right or if it's conscious, but it seems that what I'm saying is your performative persona seems to work now in other contexts as an instrument for discussion and discursive sort of activity.
I suppose it's in relation to the material practice, isn't it? You know, having those.
Well, that's what I've observed. Yes.
Yeah,
but
I think
you haven't let go of the apparently very casual, but actually really well constructed performative persona that you brought to the earlier works, which were specifically performative.
Yeah, it might be. I mean, I think I see, you know, whoever sees the work. I mean, if you with an audience who come to see an exhibition, that's a great privilege, really, because then you actually get to hear what people think. You know, even if they just walk in and walk out and say nothing.
Well, I was very struck when you showed recently with me at Cuckoo with your Reform exhibition in September that you eschewed the more traditional sort of private view. You really wanted to be there when your audience were there, when they were looking at the work, and you invited them in a much more sort of relaxed and informal way. You said, come on over and have tea and cake. So we had several sessions where the audience came and encountered the work through that kind of filter of sociability. But it mattered to you that you were there with the work.
Yeah, I think you're more likely to get, hopefully, to get some level of what people really think or feel about the work in that sort of conversation. When everybody's standing around having a glass of wine, it's all very polite, isn't it? You know, it's not like going around to somebody's house for a cuppa. You know? No. It's much, I think, what I'm interested in is hearing reflected back what people see, so that I can use that. So, for instance, at Cuckoo, I haven't actually got the image with me, but there were some very interesting reflections on some of the paintings. I don't normally do paintings, but there were some paintings there, and some of the things that people said, I then saw in that work that I just hadn't seen before, and they were quite obvious. And you know, I should have known that they were there. Why didn't I know that they were there? Because you just, you know, you have a.
I don't think should comes into it, does it?
You don't, and you just don't see the things reflected back, and it just really informs what I do. And I mean, you said that a lot of my work is quite opaque, and I'm aware that, you know, when I'm making it, I never think about what's going to be at the end, you know, at all. It happens in a very similar way to the way that my performances happen. It's just that there aren't people there necessarily when I'm actually making it, but that sort of the randomness associated with it, even though it's not about randomness, even though it's about this sort of organization, that still happens. So it's really nice to see what people and hear what people think about it, because, you know, sometimes it's so opaque that even I don't know what I'm doing. So, you know, other people can tell me what they see.
But I think the candor that you bring to that, by being willing to admit that there is opacity in the work, even for you, actually, I think that probably many artists would relate to that. I think that's a mistake that people that don't make, which is that they think we know everything about what it is that we do. And very often, particularly when it's recently made, and often work that's just being exhibited has probably been finished, you know, a couple of hours before or the day before. So it's brand new. We need time to be audience to our own work. And I think that the way that you sort of gather allies to you or invite people in a very welcoming and relaxed way to share that experience with them. So it's like you're moving between the positionality of maker and intender, and you've attributed meaning and significance to the work, but you're also very open to new discovery yourself. And there's a kind of aspect of subversion to that, which which I find really powerful in your attitude to art making, actually to your attitude to being an artist at all. When I first met you many years ago, you rejected the label of artist. You didn't want to be described as an artist. You sort of rejected that you were making art, even though you were doing a sort of MA and practice. That seems to have changed. Is that fair to say?
Well, I suppose you have to accept a title. I'm not very keen on titles, really. I think some of it is probably the reason why I started to become drawn to performance work is also it's because of the art market, isn't it? It's because of what art is seen as often as, if you're not careful, as a very elitist sort of thing, and I find that really uncomfortable. I suppose
that comes across, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, I was brought up in the Northwest. I was born in Blackpool, and it's only, you know, in the last sort of 10 years or a little bit more that I've realised, you know, that's quite a unique place, and it's a unique place of constant art. You know, it's basically an installation, the whole place, with people performing all the time. You know, whether they're holiday makers, people who run the bed and breakfasts, you know, the landladies, the bus drivers, whoever, everybody who's there is a performer in that installation.
Now, that interests me greatly, because I proposed to you when we chatted last week that I saw aspects of, you know, a kind of politics at work in your work. And I'm aware that in several pieces you have referenced, well, you've certainly referenced former industry in Fleetwood in the work you made in Norway at the Neptune Herring Factory, and you've made other works. In 2008, you did the performance down the Salt Way, and you, in your documentation for that, you referenced the workers of ancient times who would have been transporting salt down that route. You've referenced glove making when you performed for me in Festival Favours in 2017, the performance platform I put on. So it seems to me that there is a sense of identification that you have with workers, with working, with manufacture, with making stuff that's actually necessary. And I'm wondering if that's, you know, you were a little hesitant when I put that to you, but what comes across to me is a sense of solidarity, and I do mean that in sort of an emotive and a political sense, solidarity with past workers, with the lives of others. You've just referenced the context up in Blackpool where you're from. So I think within that there is a sort of political statement that you're making. And if you then look at how you reject some of the attitudes in the sort of art market, even some of the functions that get used to oil the wheels of purchasing art, like private views, I wonder if you can respond to that.
Well, yeah, I mean, some time ago, but people did say that my work had a political element to it, and I was really quite shocked because I had no idea. I mean, I've had to accept it now. It's not a conscious thing, and I think that the references to sort of trade and labour, which is what it is, comes, I think, possibly from just things like, you know, the Saturday jobs that I had and the holiday jobs that I had, and also working in agriculture. So when I went, when I moved, when I was in my first degree, I moved from botanical science directly into sort of agricultural science and plant breeding. So I was physically making new varieties, if you like. It was a very manual job. You know, obviously there was an academic background to it, but, you know, you're taking little bits off plants and adding pollen to things. And if you can't do the practical work, really, you can't make the new varieties at a beginner's level sort of thing. And, you know, you're out there doing field work, March, you come up and down in your wellies. You have to rely on the people that know cultivation skills, so that you can get your work done. You know, you rely on a chain of people, and I've always been aware of that. And I don't know whether that's partly, again, because of on the other end of the peninsula from Blackpool is Fleetwood. And there, you know, it's a fishing town, you know, that people go out for months at a time, weeks at a time, get very cold, wet, sometimes die, come home with the fish, and then the man brings it on a van on a Friday, and you eat it straight from the dock. And there's a sort of, it's a sort of chain thing, so that you know, about people's reliance on other people, and that, I think that's what it is that, you know, no matter where you are in the hierarchy, you're actually relying on you know, I suppose it's a bit like an ecological principle, isn't it? That goes back to the biology thing. Is, you know, you've got the triangle.
We all became very much more aware of those essential connections and how much we rely on trade and labour, as you put it, through the lockdown, when we became so aware of the importance of key workers and exactly who the key workers really are. So yeah, I can really relate to that.
Morrison's delivery. Thank
you. Absolutely. And I suppose I'd say too that having worked with you several times and having participated as audience in your work, your approach is very collaborative. You know, it's a real pleasure working with you as a colleague or as a curator, because you're very open and generous, I think, in the conversations you're prepared to have about the work, even when it's in a state of real flux. And, you know, that can be a really anxious time. Certainly it's an anxious time for me if I'm exhibiting, less so if I'm performing actually, but if I'm exhibiting drawings and things and putting together a representation of what I do, it's, you know, it's an anxious time. I want to do it well, and I want to be careful, you know, scrutinous about how I represent myself, what I'm really meaning to do. And I've always found you very open to dialogue, to being very flexible, change, you know, being prepared to change your mind, being prepared to think, no, that's wrong, that doesn't quite work, I'll do this or that.
There's also something as well about, and I was criticised for this when I was at art school, because one of my tutors said to me, if you don't take this seriously, nobody else is going to. But the point is that, you know, you've got to, there's a point where you've got to enjoy what you do, and it is really, really stressful. And you know, we can obsess about where we put each little thing. Everything has to be exactly right. And when you're working with other colleagues, you know, then you all know that. But then there's also a place for some enjoyment within that. And I think that's where the flexibility comes in.
Yeah.
You know, you have disasters happen.
Yeah.
All the time, don't they? So,
yeah, and we're managing expectations not only of ourselves, but in a way the expectations of an audience as well.
Yeah.
What do audiences expect to see when they go to a gallery space or an exhibition? And, you know, how much do we conform to the conventionality of, I don't know, even white walls and frames and catalogues and labels and all that stuff, you know.
That's certainly been really interesting, because having worked with you, I mean, I came to do the exhibitions at Overlay, having done my first ever real exhibition at Didcot, and that came about just by chance. It was just a little bit strange. I found it strange seeing you work, you know, presented. There's always been something about me that I quite like things, you know, people not to know whether I do art or not. Like, and with Francis will know, you know, about doing work on the hill. Well, you do as well.
Yes, I do. Definitely.
I did on Crouch Hill for the MA, and it's like, you know, I quite like the fact that people might walk past and think, well, what is this? Is this art? Is this a party? What is this? Is this just some mad person? So I like that. And of course, the trouble is that once you've got it in a white space gallery, then it's very definitely that's art, you know, and you're putting a label on it, and it changes the audience. And it changes the audience. It changes the accessibility of it as well, which is something that I find challenging. So it's quite odd for me, and in a lot of ways, I've made a lot of work that's been hidden, and I've never been quite, hidden as art, and I've never been sure, and I'm still not sure whether that's because it's part of the conceit of the work that it has to be hidden, or am I just hiding behind that because actually, it takes a lot more courage to show your work.
Well, I know that in the putting together of the Reform exhibition, you had an awful lot of work that I certainly hadn't seen, and some of the drawings and paintings which we then went on to show. And it was quite clear that your ongoing investigation into sort of archival narratives had, which I had witnessed in the earlier performance work, including On the Hill, as you say, that seemed to have led you to a more material-based art practice, and has led to you more recently showing the paintings, the drawings, the objects. So is it possible to say something about how that evolution happened, how you've become more willing to show more traditional art forms, perhaps?
Yeah, it's one of those things, isn't it? You can't quite work out when it happened, I think, but because of the coincidence of just having the work at Cornerstone, and then that followed on to the summer residency at Avada, that's 2019, which was absolutely wonderful. We didn't have to show at the end at all. So it was an open-ended summer residency, but we didn't have a show, a formal show at the end. We just had a group sort of discussion of and look at our various bits of work. But then I went straight from that into the Dwell residency. And it was a lovely October, really nice and warm, just for a few weeks at Overlay Studios, which is just a beautiful, quiet, just a really lovely place for sort of contemplation, trying to work out where I was going. And that, in the summer residency at Avada, I'd worked with some scientists from an Oxford company, not a formal residency, but an informal residency, and some other artists. And that was really interesting, because then that really knocked me straight back into my science. All of a sudden, what they were doing in their day-to-day work, one of them in particular was using a modern equivalent of something that I'd used, one of the first great clunky things, it's called an HPLC machine, of high performance liquid chromatography. It separates things out and puts them into categories and measures them. So just amazing, all of a sudden I was with these people who were not in the same field, but using the same equipment. And so that took me right back to sort of botanical roots. And that's what I started doing, because round Overlay Studios, it's just beautiful fields and a lovely garden and so on. And so then that's when I started to look at sort of botanical anatomy and bring things together, and also bring together some of the more digital things that I've been thinking about a lot, but not actually put into the work, not visibly into the work. And that's when I started sort of to do that. And now I've forgotten what the question was.
Well, it was really, yes, just you've answered it. I was asking how it was that the interest in archival narrative had led you to the more material-based practice, but you've just, talked about that. I'm aware that you have got some images. I don't know whether or not you want to put some up for us to have a look at.
I could whiz through
that would be really nice.
Slideshow to this point. Is that okay? So
I think that would be great. Yeah.
All right. Let me.
If you don't mind me interjecting, if I've got a question.
No, that's fine. I'm sharing now.
Yeah, go down to slide view.
Okay. So this one, it started in 2012. So that was when I was finishing my BA, and it's actually some laboratory glassware from the John Radcliffe Hospital that used. So it was pre-used in the biochemistry lab at the JR, where years ago I did actually have some investigations and surgery done, which possibly wouldn't be here if I hadn't had that done. And so it was a reference, I suppose, to my own personal past experience, and then putting it, kilning it. Helen Slater, glass artist in Kingham, was a great advisor on that, making it into a piece of glassware. And that was in 2012. And then they were sort of just waiting and waiting and waiting. And then I started making photograms with them, laying them on photographic paper. And then June 2021, I did start messing about with paint a bit. So this was sort of towards the end of lockdown, 2020, actually it would be. I started messing about with paint. And so this came out of that. And the thing that interests me about it is that it doesn't look like laboratory scientific glassware. It's sort of got an organic sort of.
Yeah, it almost looks like a heart, doesn't it?
Almost looks like a heart.
Heart of a lung, you know.
Almost looks like a heart or a lung or some sort of organ. So that the way that things, you know, that these things that measure. I mean, this was the idea of making the glassware, was that you'd got something which was specifically designed with measurements on it and a uniform structure, so that you could actually measure and quantify. And then if you melt it, of course, it takes away that purpose, and it becomes something much more organic.
Do you have any photos of those glass objects that you showed, the melted?
I've got that one there.
Oh yes, great, fantastic.
So that is it's not actually the same object. These were made much later. So these were made, I think, in 2019. So this was the advancement of that. So it's got digital transfer cable in. So things like I don't know, bits of SCART cable, bits of I don't know, things from a CPU in a computer, all sorts of bits of just general data transfer.
I remember when you proposed showing those, when we had one of our early meetings to look at what you might show in the exhibition. And this was a very instructive experience to me as a curator, because when you first sort of got those out and began to talk about them, maybe putting them on with sand or this or that, they were probably the works I was least drawn to. And they were ones that I was struggling to kind of get my head around. And yet, when the show happened, and it was a long time later because of the lockdown, you know, your residency became extended and the exhibition happened a year later than it ought to have done. But actually, thank goodness for that, because the work that you showed had evolved more because of that elapse. And actually, these works probably were the ones that I ended up loving the most.
Well,
they were amongst the most successful, and the audience really loved them too. So it was a real prompt to me to think, you know, don't stick with that first reaction. You know, always trust the artist to at least get the work out and see how it's working in situ. You know,
not very pleasant to look at. They're a bit weird when you see them. I mean,
they are weird.
They're a little bit uncomfortable. You know, they're not.
They're very weird. I can honestly say I've never seen anything like them, and that certainly commends them to me as a viewer and as a curator. But no, they were great.
I'll move on to the audience participation. So this was one of the first things I did that had a performative aspect. I had no idea that what I was thinking about and doing had any. I didn't even understand what performative was, you know, in those days. And I just made these little people. I was feeling a little bit. I was in London, and Anthony Gormley had his. It was the Event Horizon exhibition, you know, where he had people up all around London on the rooftops. Sort of large, rather masculine figures that were looking down on us all in London. And I didn't really feel like Anthony Gormley. I felt more like these little people, just a little bit, you know, puzzled by the whole thing. So I made these little people, and I put them on the South Bank one afternoon, really just so that I could photograph them in situ. But what happened was that while I moved away to take the photographs, people started picking them up and having their photos taken with them, and laughing at.
Oh, that's so nice.
People walking past, you know, sort of randomly having a and some of them got stolen. So when I went back after taking the picture of those ladies, I went back down onto the South Bank, and somebody said to me, "Oh, those kids have just run off with those little people." So I had to chase after them down the South Bank and take photographs of them. I let them have them in the end. They took them away, but they were on a school trip or something, and they said, "Oh yeah, somebody else has just stolen one." And so it's, you know, that I didn't understand that then that this was a sort of participative performance.
But I love how that sort of apparent, you know, the description is either they stole them or that then transmuted into gifting that you then said, yeah, have them and I'll take a photo of you. And
yeah, somebody did steal one of the others, as I say, and I don't know where that ended up. Hopefully on somebody's mantelpiece.
Fantastic.
This was unfortunately Louise isn't here. Louise Wright, who helped me with this, she was the one who was filming it and while I was on Periscope. So this was another way of engaging with a random audience. I used to really like Periscope as a means of engaging an audience, because you didn't know who you were getting. It's not like if you do Facebook Live, or I'm not sure actually, because I don't use TikTok or anything. I've moved away a little bit from live stream and Instagram Live and so on. But the wonderful thing about Periscope was it was a completely random audience. They picked you either because of your hashtags or because of your location. So if they fancied looking at somebody in the UK and they happen to be in Brisbane, they just say, oh, somebody's doing something, and
is that a comment by one of the audience? This is a poetic broadcast.
Yeah, this is a poetic broadcast. So what I was doing is I was trying to melt wax onto the patch of soil where I'd had a bonfire for May Day, to try and get an imprint, like a tabula rasa thing, of the soil. And in doing so, I was lighting candles. It was actually raining. I was trying to light candles in the rain and melt them to get a wax plate. All a bit random and rather uncomfortable actually. But it isn't on this slide. But Louise was zooming in and showing people the candles. What I didn't realise is that exactly the same time, there were people all over the world lighting candles because of the massacre in Atlanta at the gay club. And I had no idea that was happening. So people came onto the broadcast and saw this and thought that that's why I was doing it.
Wow. Okay.
And I had no idea, and that I was getting all these messages.
Yeah.
There's some, I haven't obviously put them all on here, but some of them were really tender messages, saying thank you for doing this. And then there's that sort of mixed emotion about my intention and what people have seen. Yeah, really interesting sort of tensions that you get in performance work, really. Yeah, because you don't know how people are going to feel. It's quite
well, I think working in the way that you do, and actually that often I do as well, which is in a quite a conversational way, perhaps in an unmediated public space type way, or even within a gallery space, moving amongst the audience and being open to kind of people's interpretation, and also to being challenged, like, what are you doing, or why are you doing that? You say, well, actually, it's actually art. I'm making a piece of performance art, and by conversing with me, you're sort of participating, and can I take a photo of you holding this, and that will go in the documentation. And so it is one of the interesting phenomena of choosing to work in that way when you haven't ring-fenced yourself off. It
was interesting because somebody did actually say, oh, this is obviously a piece of artwork. I'm surprised that anybody recognised it.
I'm just aware of time, so we may just put a couple more, and then
I'll whiz through shall I whiz through some images?
I love this, you and your tent up on Crouch Hill. Oh, that's the Saltway piece.
Yeah, sorry, there's no title on that one. That's the Saltway.
That's a lovely piece. Can you say a little bit about how you lay down in it? You referenced Ana Mendieta in your documentation for that piece.
Yeah, so it was. I just wanted to record the carrying of the salt from Droitwich down to London along the Saltway, and the people who did it. So I lay down one summer's day when it was warm enough, and again, Louise Wright, who sadly can't be here, poured salt over me, and then I just stood up and left the silhouette. My intention originally was to leave the salt to absorb moisture from the atmosphere, go back, every day, and record it until it had just dissolved. But luckily I had a friend who worked for the Poisons Unit in London, and I asked his advice, from a health and safety point of view, and he said, actually, salt is incredibly toxic to dogs, and you'd better remove it. So I had to sweep it up. But,
but you referenced in the documentation the Mexican artist Ana Mendieta. She's somebody that's been important to you.
Yes, a little bit. A
Yeah,
little bit, yeah. Yeah. Not key, I don't think. But this was, I had to reference her because obviously it's very like
yeah.
her work. There's another one where another friend of mine, who some of you may know, Irina, gave a spontaneous talk about her work and the difference from living in communist Russia and then coming over here to work, which is actually has a new sort of relevance now, actually. But that was in an office block just off Oxford Street in London.
And are you proposing that as a piece of your work?
Yes, yeah, because I set it up. It's like a sort of, as a director, I often do that. It's more like a sort of loose directorial role. I'll provide the materials. Here are the materials. This is what I'd like you to do. Go in. She recited a poem, I think, in Russian, and just described her own personal experience. It was at the time of the crash. Do you remember? And so a lot of offices in London were completely empty because people had just, yeah, everything had gone down. I'll leave that one, actually. So this is more about archival work. So this started in 2007. I did this one, which is sort of imprinted print on wax and muslin. So there was thinking about books, and this moved on after many years to this folio series for home books.
Home Books was an exhibition again at Cuckoo at Overlay Studio back in about a year ago. Rhiannon, myself, Annie Rapstoff and Peter Lloyd making artist books. Yeah. And these are the books, the folio series that Rhiannon showed.
Yeah, so that's those really showing, they're different pages, they're almost different pages of an archive, but instead of being set in a bound in a piece of work, a publication, they're scattered and fragmented and mobile, so they can be moved around and displayed in different ways. So sort of breaking it up, really. And then they became aspects of that, not the same pieces, but the same images of those archives then became these sort of other sculptures, which were in reform. And that's actually inside. So then it was like exploring within the sculpture with your endoscope.
Yes, yes.
So it's almost a little bit like the psychogeography of an archive and psychogeography of memory, I suppose, if that makes sense. And this one here was made from some photograms. Again, these were photograms, not drawn images. So these were made from some of the photograms that I made during the Avada residency with the scientists. This was the first iteration. Then the same images actually became this, which was in reform. So it's sort of taking these archival images and then just making them into different things all the time.
So I guess this am I right, this brings us pretty much up to date. I mean, this was shown, reform was shown in last autumn.
Yeah.
So what are you working on now, and what do you think will be coming next, Rhiannon?
I don't know at all. I've been doing a lot of, the old studio tidying, that thing. You don't know what you're doing.
That thing, yeah.
Clearing it out.
That can go on for a long time in my
studio. Can go on for a long time. So what I was hoping to do was to work. Normally, what I do, and I think a lot of us do, is that you have bits of stuff that you've made that you didn't show or you think isn't finished, but you don't go back to finish it off. You move on to something else. So what I would like to do, but I don't know whether I will do, because it's a bit sort of counterintuitive for me, is to work into those things and see where that takes me. Carry on just, using the same materials and making them again into other things. So that's the thought, but I don't know. We'd better stop there, haven't we?
Can't wait to see what comes next. Thanks, Rhiannon.
Thank you, Claire.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much for letting us listen into your really exciting conversation, and great to see some more images as well, Rhiannon, on top of the ones that you've been sharing as part of your Instagram residency. Thank you. So we've got a few minutes now. If anybody has any questions that they want to add and ask Rhiannon, or both Claire and Rhiannon, so feel free to either pop it in the chat or just pop your microphone on. And while you have a little think about those, just one quick question for you, Rhiannon. So obviously we've been reading your blog post and seeing all those images that you've been sharing. I just wondered whether you might be able to share where else we can access your work or see a bit more about your practice.
Oh, do you want me to put my website in the chat?
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
Though I have to say that it is a website that needs serious updating.
And of course, you've got your Instagram as well that you've been sharing as.
Oh gosh, of course. Yes, I'm terribly sorry. Yes, of course.
Can you give us a reminder of where we can find that?
Yeah. So that's at Sangronen. So let me just. I'll get rid of that. So that one is at Sangronen, which is in the chat there.
Ah, brilliant, thank you.
Yeah.
And GROWNUN, awesome, thank you.
Yeah. That means someone grown from the sand.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's a local. So there's an argument about whether it's Morecambe or Blackpool or possibly, I think, parts of Liverpool. But yeah, the idea is that if you're born there, strictly, I think if your parents were born there, which doesn't apply to me, but if you're born there, then you can call yourself a sand-grown one. So
I never knew that. I've often wondered why that was your handle.
Yeah,
beautiful. Seems really apt now that we've heard a bit more about your practice.
Yeah,
brilliant. Thank you.
Okay.
Does anyone else have any questions they want to ask, or any thoughts or comments after listening to the conversation?
Hi. I just had a thought, actually, if I may. I was very struck by your comment that Blackpool is like an entire installation, which is a great way of looking at it. But also, I think, are we now entire installations when we think of our modern day building a profile of ourselves on Instagram or Facebook or redoing something? Is our life now a complete installation and not a kind of reality? I'm just was struck by that sort of concept.
I suppose so. It always, in the end, it goes back to Shakespeare, doesn't it? And all the world's a stage. I suppose. Yeah, I think what's happened, I don't know about an installation, but certainly, I mean, I think everybody would agree that everything we do now is archived. You know, everything, for the majority of people. You know, you've got your Instagram, everybody's putting everything on Facebook. You know, at one time, people had a small photo album, whereas now, it's there. It's, you know, people, we think that it's gone because we're not seeing it anymore, but it's not. It's there, not quite forever, but you know, it's all certainly recorded.
So is that a bit more of a kind of more true reality then that we have now, in a way, that we can see everything that we did rather than just remembering? There's this sort of dichotomy between what we remember and what the evidence is, I suppose.
Oh, well, yeah, that's an interesting thing, that think about truth and fiction, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things. Did you come up to the conversations we had on the Hill, Rachel?
No, I didn't actually.
No, because that a lot of that sort of personal story, truth fiction thing was the background to those things. That so that what I did was I'd invited different people to do different things in different places and just have conversations about the place, and it's like a psychogeographic exploration of various places, but particularly Crouch Hill, just outside Banbury, and that's where, you know, that's where that truth fiction thing, it's all muddled up, isn't it? You know, how do you, what do you remember? is what you remember the truth anyway? Is it the truth for you? How does that change over time? If you have the photographs, is that a representation? Is Instagram a representation of my practice? Is Facebook the representation of somebody's family life? You know, I would say things are probably more fictional than they've ever been.
I'm just going to have to go for somebody's at the door. Sorry to interrupt, but that was very interesting.
Fascinating question, thanks.
I noticed too that aspects of my memory that I don't really need to use any longer. I mean, I don't any longer need to remember things like phone numbers. I haven't needed to remember a phone number for probably a decade because I've got them all in the palm of my hand in a cell phone. And if I think about the way that I had to research when I was an undergraduate, which was in the 80s, which was just pre-internet, although it was actually in development, it was through, you know, libraries and books. And, you know, you worked in a very exploratory way. You'd go and look in one book and see a reference to another artist, then hope you'd get a book on them. If you were lucky, you got to photocopy a few pages. If the librarian wasn't looking, you got to photocopy a few more. There wasn't the sort of roaming on the internet and the algorithms suggesting things for us to look at. And so research was very different, and the way that we stored information and brought it into our practice was very different. I'm very intrigued to see now how some artists on Instagram and Facebook literally publish, it seems to me, everything they ever do, every mark, every sketch, every idea. Whereas the artists never did that. You saw their work when they chose to exhibit it. You didn't see it in progress, certainly not on an hour-by-hour basis. You know.
I know. It's one of the things that I remember discussing with somebody when I was at CSM, because they had the big windows that were on Charing Cross Road. And I said, it's really interesting. Everybody thinks, you know, that this is an art school, and they think this is where sort of miracles happen, that people sort of just go and make art because they're like geniuses, you know, so that they just make this amazing stuff, rather than seeing the graft that goes into it and how good it would be to take over the windows, because we could use the windows from time to time, take over the windows and actually have artists making their work using those windows as their studio, so people who were walking along Charing Cross Road could see what they were doing and demystify it, you know. That was 2012, and I didn't do anything about it because I was doing other things. Shame, because that would have been a really interesting project. But of course now on Instagram you see every step that everybody's making, so it's completely altered the way that
well, I'd say that those that choose to, and I think there is possibly a generational aspect to that, and far from wanting to sound like an old fogey or somebody who rejects innovation and modernity, far from it. I use technology all the time, but I do like to make choices about how much I invite people into my thinking processes and the experimental stages of the work. You know, I don't necessarily feel it needs visibility. So I'm really intrigued, and I follow a lot of people and I see their work every day as it's unfolding. I'm interested in that impulse, you know.
I was interested in doing that. You know, I thought, it would be an interesting thing to do, to show people how I make things. But now, given the opportunity on Instagram, I actually don't want to do it, which is fascinating, isn't it? Yeah, really, really interesting. Yeah. Any other questions? Ruth?
I was just thinking, like, it kind of ties in with Rachel's question as well and what you've just said. But I was just thinking around also the kind of tactile, when you put everything out there, you know, on Instagram or social media and everything, that there's quite a very tactile element to your work. And I know, you know, we've walked together and creatively as well, but we both kind of reach out to touch. And at the moment it was lichens and mosses that you were touching. But I was just thinking, seeing your images there, it's like, it's a thread throughout. There's always, whether it's linked to science or taking the camera inside something, it's quite physical. And that kind of being in a place or a material, or it's whether it links you into people or audience, Crouch Hill, you know, you're kind of in a place touching the grass and whether there's anything.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in the end, one of the reasons why I started doing artwork is because of the physical feeling that it gave me when I did it. So I used to cycle a lot, sort of competitive club level cycling, and when I had my son, when I was pregnant with my son, I couldn't do that when I became heavily pregnant. And I remember doing a drawing, and I actually got the same physical feeling out of doing the drawing that I had when I'd done a race. You know, that sort of endorphin feeling. And I think, yeah, there's a lot about the physical affect of place, collaboration, materials that you're working with. Those are the things that I enjoy about the work, you know, about making the work. That the physical responses I get, and that ties in, I think, to I'm always referring back to sort of embodied archive, the feelings that we have that are, you know, sort of that within us, that we've, the layers of those that have accumulated over the years, and how that's reanimated through whatever it is that we're doing, you know, whether we're artists or just having a chat with somebody. Don't know if that makes any sense at all. Okay, thank you, Ruth. That was, yeah, interesting.
Fantastic. Thank you for some really great questions. Any last comments before we close for today? Just for the recording as well. Thanks, Rhiannon, for putting your website into the chat. So it's www.vectorcatalyst.wordpress.com. Brilliant. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Claire and Rhiannon, for your time and insight and generosity today, sharing your conversation with us. It's been really brilliant to listen in. So this recording will be popped up on Rhiannon's blog post on the Avada website, so you can listen back to it whenever you like, and look out for the announcement of the next Avada Associates feature artist as well, who Rhiannon has selected for us. But otherwise, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Rhiannon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you for coming, everybody. Bye.
Yeah.